it can be really hard to cut through the fog when it comes to painting shaker doors. There are so many products on the market, whether you're painting alcove units or kitchen doors. You go in any paint shop, there are primers, sealers, top coats, there's everything everywhere, and it can really be quite intimidating to know what products to use. Now, I've spoken with a handful of painters and decorators which paint handmade doors and handmade kitchens on a daily basis to really try and narrow the process down to what is quite an easy and challenge-free process for anyone to do at home, looking to really cut the cost of the painting process, because it can cost thousands and thousands to paint and get the right finish through the right professional to do the job. However, of course, getting a really nice forgiving paint finish on an alcove unit or a kitchen or a small utility is doable at home with just the right steps, the right paints. So there are quite a few products on the market which you can use. Now, we find when painting products, a lot of customers want the Farrow and Ball kind of finish, which is the estate eggshells, the modern eggshells. Now, the estate eggshell is a little bit less of a gloss, whereas the modern is a little bit more gloss. However, they are cracking paints to paint with. Now, it is important, if you're only painting an alcove unit, you won't need to prime really, especially if you're using Farrow and Ball estate eggshell, because when you're painting the doors, the eggshell, the estate eggshell, can be used as a primer. It can be used right from the offset to seal around that MDF grain. So if you're only doing a small project like an alcove unit, I wouldn't go and buy 30 or 40 quid's worth of primer to use 6 tablespoons of it. It's just not worth it whatsoever. So when you are painting the doors, it is also very important that you wet your paint down as well, so it runs really nicely around the doors. But before we do any of that, the first thing we need to do is get rid of all the surface dust and things like that on the doors, and then we can get that end grain prepped on the door, because that anyone relates to any kind of MDF or anything like that, we really want to get that end grain sealed, and in this short clip we'll make sure we do so. So the first step in painting any door, now when painting MDF, is that horrible fuzz on the end. We want to address that first because it needs a few coats. So if you can imagine MDF, there is like little fibres popping up. Now if you just try and sand the edge straight up, all you'll do is disturb them fibres and they'll just pull out and other fibres will come out. So what we need to do is seal them edges. Now, like I said earlier, if you're only doing a small project, there's no point spending a ton on primer when something like Farrow and Ball can be just as good. So in this case here, let's say we're doing a kitchen, so it's worth the while investing in a decent primer because it's going to go further. And let's face it, you don't want to spend 60 quid on Farrow and Ball for it to be the first 2 coats that you're never going to see. So first step, let's get the edge sealed on the door. So now we need to seal the edge. So before we do that, let's take a microfiber cloth which is damp. Now you can use tack cloths as well. Just go around the entire door and just take any dust or anything like that off of the door. And then you do not want it sticking to your paintbrushes, your rollers, or just passing it around the door as you're painting it. Right, so as we paint the edge now, don't worry about any paint which is bleeding over onto the shaker part, because what we can do with a damp rag, now it's good if you've got a couple of them available, we can wipe the edge, because if you were to paint the side now and start trying to paint the rails, the paint dries, and then what it'll do is, especially on your later coats, it'll bleed through the door and you'll see it and it will just look a right mess. So as long as just get the outer edge done, make it simple for yourself. And don't put too much paint on your brush, just keep the brush nice and light, because you've only got to wipe that edge once you're done with it, you see. So, as well, it's important when you're painting doors, especially if you live in a busy household and you're wanting to paint the doors a darker colour, simply because if you prime the doors white, and let's say 6 months down the line, somebody nicks a door, you'll see white primer through it. So as well, it's just something to bear in mind. If your doors are going to go a darker colour, you can, if there's not many doors as well, that's important to note. If there aren't many doors, you can just paint straight on with the Farrow and Ball colour, especially the darker Farrow and Ball colours, just paint them straight on. And then that way, if in future you do ever nick the door, you won't see white primer, and it will just give that door a little bit more endurance as well. So as we're painting the door, just go round with a damp microfiber cloth and just wipe the edges of the door, and it just helps separate the door into easy paintable steps. Don't worry about any of this, just try and wipe off as much as you can. Wipe the back of the door as well as you're painting. Now, a good reason we paint the edge first, like I said earlier, is just to seal that end. Just move the door over ever so slightly. Is just to seal that MDF fibre, because there's no point trying to do anything to it until you paint it and the paint sets and holds them fibres in place, so that when you do come across with your sandpaper at a later date, it sort of cuts them fibres instead of just aggravating them and moving them and fuzzing it up again. Because even if you put filler in, the filler's you're just gonna sand it out and you're gonna make it fuzzy again. So it's better to put something like paint in, and then that way, when you sand it, you're only sanding it once. Just turn the door around and we'll paint the back side. And this way as well, separating the door into parts, it makes the door actually easier to handle as well. So ideally you want to give this 2 coats on the edge. So this door is going to be for an alcove unit. So we're not going to prime the rest of the door. In Zinza, we're just going to prime it with our Farrow and Ball. Now, Zinza is the go-to product that we use for priming on Farrow and Ball and things like that. Zinza is absolutely bulletproof. So that's 1 coat done. As you can see, it's quite simple and straightforward. We'll let that dry and then just repeat the process for another coat. And then once you have done that, we will then be ready, to put some paint on the door itself. So now we've gone round the edge with our primer twice to really lock in them MDF fibres, we want to be looking for some imperfections in the door. So if we go over it again with our fine cloth, which again is slightly damp, you just want to remove all the rubbish from the door, all the fine dust. Now, once you've done that, we can go round filling the edge with a 2-prep filler if you need to. This is the go-to one we use. It's absolutely perfect for filling them really small imperfections that you will actually see when you paint the door, especially if you're going in a lighter colour and your kitchen or alcove unit, wherever it may be positioned in the house, catches a bit of sunlight. You'll see them. Trust me, you will see them. So get that fine filler in there if you can. And then once you've done that, let it dry, and that's when we can sand the door. So in this case, we don't need to use the 2-prep filler, but let's say we've put a bit in and it's set. So what we want to do is sand the edges of the door. Now it's important to keep your sanding block nice and square. Don't rub like this, because then you'll sand more here, then you'll sand less there. So just pop it on the edge of the door with a nice firm pressure and just pull nice and gently down the door. Now, it is important to note, if you have used 2-prep filler, this stuff is super fine and it's so easy to sand once it's set. So it is just, don't overwork the edges. Just keep, once you pull the sander down the door once, just have a slight feel of the door and you really will notice the difference. So once you've done that, do all 4 sides and the face if you need to. Now, the block is perfect for getting in them corners. So just work the door wherever you need to work it and you'll feel the door smooth. Right, so once you've gone over the door with a fine filler and you've given it a quick sand and you think you're ready for some paint, use your microfiber cloth again. Keep taking the dust off the door as you go, and then have a feel of the door, feel for any imperfections. And it's also important as well, you can at this stage use your iPhone if you want to for the torch and just glare your torch across the door, and you'll be surprised how many imperfections it may pull up if they are there. And it's good to get them at this stage, because you can always do some more filling now and come back and sand. The process is simply just the same. So now we've done that, we're ready for a top coat. So now we've done that, we're ready for our first coat of paint. Now this is only an alcove door, so we're not going to prime it again. We're going to go straight on with the estate eggshell of Farrow and Ball. We're going to wet the paint down to around 10 to 20%. It just makes the paint so much easier to work with. Now, again, if you are painting a kitchen, it's better to invest in the Zinza 123 Bullseye Primer, because it'll go a bit further for a little less cost. So now we're going to paint the Faro and Ball straight onto the door. Right, okay, so we're ready for our first coat of paint. Now, again, like we did with the sides, break it down. We've got the sides, the centre panel, and the shaker design. So now we're going to paint the centre of the door. Now, as you're cutting in, paint will bleed onto the shaker. So just keep your microfiber cloth close by with a damp, again, nice and damp, and you can wipe off that bleeding edge. Again, if you try and paint it in, it will just come through the coats. And as you look at the door, especially when it gets a bit of light on it, you'll see where it's come through. So it's important, just keep the door into its separate parts and it'll work out perfect. So the paint that we're using is Estate Eggshell by Faro and Ball, and it's Pavilion Grey. Now we've wet the paint down between sort of 10 to 15%. That's just so we can work the paint. The thicker the paint, it's like putting jackets on. The more jackets you put on, the less sort of curvy you get, and the jackets won't follow the contour. So the less paint and the thinner the paint, it'll follow the door so much better, and you'll end up with nice, crisp cuts and corners and edges and stuff. You won't get any sort of fatty edges or anything like that, and the door will just look really, really professional when you're done. So now we're ready to paint the centre panel of the door. Now, again, we'll split it into certain sections. We'll paint the centre because that then means we can handle the door wherever we need to. So we're going to paint the centre section now. It's important, work your way, so with your paint, work your way from the corners out like that. And if any paint bleeds onto the edges, we can wipe that with our cloth. So we'll work our way like that round the door. Now, don't worry about the paint that's bled over onto the edges. We'll come back just before we cut in with the roller. We'll come back with that and wipe that off. Just make sure you get enough paint in the door to start with. Now, with your microfiber cloth, just come in and take off any paint which is bled over the edge. We want to really, if we can, try and avoid them fatty edges. We want the door to remain looking sharp. And as you can see, the way we paint the door just means that we can handle the door a little bit better, so we're not putting our hands in paint. Now we can come in with the roller. Just don't put too much paint on the roller to begin with. So now we're coming to the end there. We'll just, where we've just missed some bits, make sure you really work your paintbrush into the corner. I don't want any paint sitting in them corners. There we go. Now with your roller, as the paint sort of, because you watered it down, it will dry quite quickly. Now it's important as well, just with the roller, just to get rid of them bubbles, you're just letting the weight of the roller just spread its weight to get rid of them bubbles. Now that's one coat done in the centre. Now you might find between coats it needs a little sanding down. That's absolutely fine. Just make sure you use a sanding block, because if you end up just folding your sandpaper like that and using your hand, you'll find that you're sanding sections, and we don't want that. So just make sure you always use a sanding block, one that can get right into them corners and keep a smooth surface. Once that begins to go tacky, we can paint the frame of the door. Okay, so now we will paint, we've done the centre panel, that's obviously setting nicely. Now we will do the edges of the door. Now, just like we did earlier, it's quite a similar process when it comes to the edges. Just be generous with your paint. but not putting too much on the brush to begin with. If your brush does get clogged up, just have a nice scrap piece of material at the side, same with your roller, that you can offload that paint with should you need to. So we've gone round the frame there once. Sorry, I find that certain sections of the door still need a little bit of filler in, and with wetting the paint down as well, it's quite beneficial because you can put multiple coats. You can get 5 or 6 coats of paint on the door and still keep all them really nice details in there. So don't worry too much about getting the paint absolutely everywhere at the moment. Right, so we've painted the edges now. We've painted the centre panel. We'll paint the frame. So just nice and gently. We're not really putting a lot of pressure on there. Just keeping it nice, offloading the paint. Now, like I said earlier, at any stage if you feel that there's just too much paint on your roller, it's good to just have a scrap piece near you. Then you can just offload that paint because you'll never put it back in the tray because of all the paint you've pulled up into the tray. So we've painted all the door now, we've painted all the sides, the panel. Now you just need to repeat the same process for the back of the door as well. Now you might find that once you light up the door, it's good to have a light, an iPhone torch, something like that, and that'll pull up any imperfections because the door now is the colour that the door is going to be. So a light is handy just to pull up any tiny imperfections that you can still fill with the 2-prep filler at this stage and then just sand down. You might even get to the 3rd coat and still be putting a bit of filler in. That's absolutely fine because the end finish will be so worth it. Now, the door at this stage is just a little bit tacky, and if you find that there's just a few little bubbles in there, just let the roller work them out. So we've put a few coats on the paint now. The roller has been worked on a few coats now. We just want to offload a bit of the paint. As you can see, it really builds up on this edge here. So you just really want to offload all that paint there and just get your roller back to a bit of an empty state. Now, you could use a bit of cardboard for this, an offcut of wood, anything really, just to offload that paint, just so your roller is ready to go again. As you can see there, a lot of the paint is now off and it's ready to go again. So the products we've used to paint this door, now in my opinion, Zinza 123 Bullseye is an absolute bulletproof product, and the best part about it is that between coats it can be sanded down, filled. You can really work the product, and it's super duper compatible with the Farrow and Ball estate eggshells, modern eggshells. So it's an absolute fantastic product. It can be picked up from Screwfix and things like that. I think this tin was like 31 quid, so it's a good investment, especially if you're painting a large area. You don't want to be wasting 65, 70 quid's worth of Farrow and Ball just to prime a kitchen. This product is absolutely perfect to do so. Now, as you're working your way through them coats, of course, things are going to need to be filled. That's where this thing comes in. 2-prep fine surface filler is absolutely fantastic for all them little imperfections that you will have between the coats, and it can be sanded down super duper easy. It's not like them other 2-part fillers which you're breaking your back to sand. This stuff is super duper workable and easy to work with between them coats. Now, this stuff, any home furniture which gets painted, in my opinion, gets painted with this stuff right here. Farrow and Ball is absolutely fantastic. Now, when it comes to kitchen doors and alcove unit doors and stuff like that, there's really only 2 you want to be painting with, and it's the estate eggshell and the modern eggshell. Now, the modern eggshell is just about 20 to 30% more of a shine than the estate eggshell. Now, these paints are great because you can water them down, and as you work in them coats, the paint stays really thin and workable and is super duper easy to work with. In this video, we've watered the paint down around 15%, so it's super easy to work with. You don't get them fatty edges, and you get an absolute bulletproof finish once the paint cures.